The train screeched to a halt at Centralia station, September 27, 1864. A hot Missouri morning. Dust swirled around the iron wheels as steam hissed from the locomotive. Inside the passenger cars, 23 Union soldiers looked out the windows and saw 40 horsemen with pistols drawn, sitting motionless on their mounts. The soldiers were unarmed. They were heading home on furlough. They had no weapons, no way to fight, no way to run. The man leading the horsemen had long black hair that fell past his shoulders. His eyes were empty, cold, the eyes of someone who had stopped being human a long time ago. On his saddle, braided into the leather, were things that made the soldiers' blood turn to ice. Hair, human hair, scalps, dozens of them. His name was William Anderson. They called him Bloody Bill. And what happened in the next hour would become one of the most brutal moments in American history. But here is what the history books leave out. There was something in Bill Anderson's saddlebag that morning. Something he touched before every killing. Something that explained everything about who he was and why he did what he did. We will come back to that. Because to understand what happened at Centralia, you need to know what the Union Army did to a 14-year-old girl named Josephine. And that story changes everything you think you know about the Civil War. The American Civil War was not just a war between North and South. In Missouri, it was something far worse. It was a war of neighbors killing neighbors, families torn apart, brother against brother in the most literal sense. Think about that for a moment. Imagine living in a place where your neighbor, the man you traded grain with last harvest, might shoot you in your own doorway because of which army you secretly supported. Imagine sending your children to hide in the cellar every time hoofbeats approached. Imagine not knowing, when you woke each morning, whether your farm would still be standing by nightfall. That was Missouri in 1863. That was the world Bill Anderson grew up in. Missouri was a border state, officially part of the Union, but with deep Southern sympathies. And along the Kansas-Missouri border, a different kind of war was being fought, a brutal, personal, merciless war that had nothing to do with grand battles or noble causes. This was not Gettysburg. This was not the honorable warfare of uniformed soldiers meeting on open fields. This was something far older, far darker. This was blood feud warfare, vendetta killing, the kind of violence that humans have practiced since the beginning of time, intimate, personal, and absolutely without mercy. On one side were the Jayhawkers and Redlegs, Union-aligned guerrillas from Kansas, who crossed into Missouri to raid, burn, and kill anyone suspected of Confederate sympathies. They did not wear uniforms. They did not take prisoners. They burned farms. They executed men in front of their families. They took everything. The Jayhawkers had their own grievances. Kansas had been a battleground even before the Civil War officially began. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers had fought pitched battles in what historians call Bleeding Kansas. Men had died, families had been destroyed, and now, with a real war providing cover, the survivors had license to settle old scores. On the other side were the bushwhackers, Confederate guerrillas who answered violence with violence, men like William Quantrill, men like Cole Younger, men like Frank and Jesse James, and men like Bill Anderson. The bushwhackers were not soldiers in any traditional sense. They wore no uniforms. They answered to no regular commanders. They operated in small bands, striking Union targets and then melting back into the Missouri wilderness. They knew every hollow, every creek, every path through the Ozark forests. They were impossible to catch and absolutely ruthless when cornered. But Bill Anderson was not always Bloody Bill. That is something most people do not understand. The monster they would later describe in Union reports. The man with 53 scalps on his saddle was not born that way. He was made. And the Union Army made him. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened at Centralia. It did not come from nowhere. It was not random violence. It was the end point of a very specific chain of events. A chain that began with a family, a farm, and a 14-year-old girl who loved her older brother. William Anderson was born in 1840 in Kentucky. His family moved to Missouri when he was young, then later to Kansas. They were farmers, simple people. Bill had 3 sisters, Mary Ellen, Josephine, and Martha. By all accounts, he was protective of them, especially Josephine. She was the youngest, 14 years old in 1863. She looked up to her big brother like he was invincible. There are no photographs of Josephine Anderson that survive. We do not know the color of her hair or her eyes. We do not know her favorite song or her secret dreams. History has erased almost everything about her except her death, and that death. That death would echo across Missouri for years. The Andersons were not wealthy slave owners. They were not Confederate officers. They were just a family trying to survive in a land that was tearing itself apart. But survival was not an option in Kansas, Missouri in 1863. Bill's father, William Sr., was killed early in the conflict. Some say by Jayhawkers, some say by Union soldiers. The historical record is unclear. What is clear is that Bill Anderson was barely 22 when he became the man of his family. A family of women. A family without protection in a war zone. 22 years old. Think about that. Today, a 22-year-old might be finishing college, might be starting their first real job, might be figuring out who they want to be. Bill Anderson, at 22, was already a killer, already hardened by years of border violence, already watching over his mother and 3 sisters in a place where simply being related to a known Confederate sympathizer could get you murdered. And then General Thomas Ewing, Jr. issued Order Number 11. Order Number 11. Remember that name, because it explains everything that came after. In August 1863, General Ewing ordered the forced evacuation of 4 entire counties in Missouri. Every family suspected of Confederate sympathies, even the slightest sympathy, was to be removed from their homes. Their farms were burned, their livestock was slaughtered, their possessions were taken. The official reasoning was military necessity. Bushwhacker guerrillas depended on the local population for food, shelter, and information. Remove the population, and you remove the guerrillas' ability to operate. In practice, it was collective punishment on a massive scale. Thousands of families, men, women, children, the elderly, were driven from their homes with almost no warning. Many had done nothing wrong. Many had tried to remain neutral in a war that allowed no neutrality. It did not matter. The columns of refugees streaming out of western Missouri were compared even at the time to the Trail of Tears. Families carried what they could, left behind everything they could not, watched their homes and barns burn as they walked away. But that was not the worst part. The worst part happened in Kansas City. Union forces had been hunting bushwhacker guerrillas for months. They could not catch the men. So they went after their families instead, the women, the sisters, the mothers. It was a tactic as old as war itself. If you cannot defeat the enemy directly, make them come to you by threatening what they love. Hostages, human shields, leverage. Bill Anderson's 3 sisters, Mary Ellen, Josephine, and Martha, were arrested. Along with other women connected to bushwhacker families, they were imprisoned in a makeshift jail in Kansas City, a building that was not designed to hold prisoners, a building that was structurally unsound. The women were held on the 2nd and 3rd floors. Below them, Union soldiers had been removing support beams. Some historians say this was for firewood. Others say it was deliberate sabotage. The truth died with the rubble. On August 13, 1863, that building collapsed. Picture it, a hot summer afternoon in Kansas City. The women prisoners hear a strange groaning sound. The floor beneath them begins to tilt. And then, chaos, screams, falling timber, choking dust, bodies tumbling through the air. When the building fell, 5 women were killed outright. Others were badly injured. Mary Ellen Anderson survived but would be crippled for life. Martha was hurt but recovered. Josephine Anderson was one of those killed. She was 14 years old. Reports say she screamed for 6 minutes before the rubble crushed her completely. 6 minutes, that is not a quick death. That is not a merciful death. That is 6 minutes of terror and pain, and slowly being crushed while people above you struggled to dig through the wreckage. 6 minutes while her sisters screamed her name. 6 minutes while soldiers, the same soldiers who had arrested her, who had put her in that building, watched and tried to pull away the debris. 6 minutes while a 14-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong except have a brother in the guerrillas felt her life being squeezed out of her. Bill Anderson was not there. He heard about it days later. A messenger brought him the news while he was camped in the Missouri wilderness. They say he did not speak for 3 days. They say something broke inside him that never healed. When they pulled Josephine's body from the rubble, her dress was torn and soaked in blood. Someone, no one knows who, saved that dress, and somehow it ended up in Bill Anderson's hands. He kept it for 18 months in his saddlebag. He touched it before every battle, before every killing. That is what was in the saddlebag at Centralia, that blood-stained dress. The last physical connection to a sister who had looked up to him, a sister he had failed to protect, a sister who had screamed for 6 minutes while Union soldiers watched. Every time Bill Anderson killed a Union soldier after that day, part of him was still trying to dig through that rubble, still trying to reach Josephine, still trying to save her. He never could. No amount of killing would ever bring her back, but he could not stop trying. After Josephine died, Bill Anderson joined Quantrill's raiders officially. He had ridden with them before, but now it was different. He was not fighting for the Confederacy anymore. He was not fighting for Missouri. He was fighting for blood, for vengeance, for a 14-year-old girl who screamed for 6 minutes under a pile of rubble while Union soldiers watched. Quantrill's raiders were the most famous, or infamous, Confederate guerrilla unit of the war. William Quantrill himself was a complicated figure, brilliant tactician, ruthless killer. Some saw him as a hero of Southern resistance, others saw him as a war criminal. Both assessments had evidence to support them. Under Quantrill, Bill Anderson found a home, found a purpose, found other men who had lost as much as he had and were willing to do anything, to make the other side pay. Within weeks, Bill Anderson earned a new name, Bloody Bill. The stories spread across Missouri like wildfire. Stories of a man who showed no mercy, a man who executed prisoners, a man who collected scalps, a man whose eyes had turned to ice and never thawed. Scalping. It is hard to talk about, but it happened. It was practiced by both sides in the border war, though neither side liked to admit it. The bushwhackers learned it partly from Native American allies, partly from the Jayhawkers themselves. It was psychological warfare, a way to terrify the enemy, a way to keep count. Bill Anderson kept count, 53 scalps. That was the number Union soldiers found on his saddle after he died. 53 different human beings, reduced to trophies braided into leather. But here is what most people miss about Bloody Bill Anderson. He was systematic. He was not a mindless killer. He was a meticulous one. He kept count. He knew every name. Every scalp on his saddle represented someone specific. And before he killed a Union soldier or sympathizer, he always asked the same question. We will come back to that question, because it is the key to understanding Centralia. By September 1864, Bill Anderson's reputation was legendary. Union commanders in Missouri had standing orders to shoot him on sight. They had put a bounty on his head. They had sent entire regiments to hunt him down. None of them succeeded. Bill was too fast, too brutal, too willing to do things that regular soldiers could not imagine. He commanded around 80 guerrillas by then, hard men who had all lost something to the war, men like Frank James and his younger brother Jesse, who was only 17, but had already seen more death than most soldiers see in a lifetime. Jesse James in 1864 was not yet the legendary outlaw. He was a teenager, tall and thin, with pale blue eyes that people said never blinked when he was about to kill someone. He had joined the guerrillas after Union militia ransacked his family's farm, tortured his stepfather, and nearly hanged his mother. Like Bill Anderson, Jesse James had reasons to hate. Like Bill Anderson, Jesse James had lost something irreplaceable, and like Bill Anderson, Jesse James would spend the rest of his life trying to fill that emptiness with violence. There was something about Jesse James that Bill Anderson noticed early on. The boy was cold, calculating. He did not hesitate. When Bill gave an order, Jesse followed it without question. There was potential in that coldness, a darkness that matched Bill's own. Little did anyone know that this 17-year-old would survive Centralia and go on to become the most famous outlaw in American history. But that is getting ahead of the story. On the morning of September 27, 1864, Bill Anderson and his guerrillas rode into the town of Centralia. Missouri. They had approximately 80 men. They were looking for supplies, for information, for Union soldiers. Centralia was a small railroad town, population maybe a few hundred, a depot for the North Missouri Railroad, nothing special about it except for one thing. Trains passed through. The railroad was the Union's lifeline in Missouri. Troops and supplies moved on those rails. Information traveled by telegraph alongside them. Hitting a railroad was not just robbery, it was striking at the heart of Union logistics. And on that particular morning, a train was coming. Bill's men took positions around the town. They robbed the general store. They took what supplies they needed. Some of them started drinking whiskey they found. It was not yet noon. The townspeople of Centralia watched in terror. They knew who these men were. Everyone in Missouri knew the bushwhackers by now, knew what they were capable of, knew that the best strategy was to stay quiet, hand over valuables without protest, and pray. Then they heard it, the distant whistle of a steam locomotive. Bill Anderson raised his hand. His men stopped what they were doing. They mounted their horses, and they waited. The train was the stagecoach of the North Missouri Railroad heading east. When it pulled into Centralia Station, the engineer saw 80 armed men on horseback surrounding the depot. He had no choice but to stop. Bill Anderson rode his horse directly to the passenger car doors. The engine hissed. Steam rose into the September sky. Dust settled around the motionless horses. For a moment, everything was still. Then Bill Anderson dismounted and walked toward the train, his spurs jingling with each step. Inside the train were civilians, farmers, merchants, women, children, and mixed among them 23 Union soldiers. They were from the 1st Missouri Engineers and other regiments. They were heading home on furlough. Their weapons had been shipped separately. They were completely unarmed. When Bill Anderson's men boarded the train, the terror began. The guerrillas moved through the cars systematically. They robbed the civilians of money and valuables, but did not harm them. They were looking for something specific, blue uniforms. There is a terrible moment when someone realizes they are about to die. A moment when hope finally breaks, when the truth becomes unavoidable. For 23 Union soldiers on that train, that moment came when they saw the guerrillas examining uniforms, checking insignias, asking questions. When they found the first Union soldier, they dragged him off the train, then the second, then the third. One by one, 23 men were pulled from their seats and forced to stand on the platform in the hot Missouri sun. These were not combat troops. They were engineers, support personnel, men who built bridges and repaired railroads, men who thought their war service was safe, far from the front lines. Men who had survived the most dangerous year of the conflict and were finally going home. None of them would make it. Bill Anderson rode his horse close to the line of prisoners. His eyes moved over each one, slowly, deliberately, like he was looking for something specific. Then he spoke for the first time. "Take off your uniforms, all of you, every piece." The soldiers hesitated. They did not understand. Some thought this was a robbery, that they would be stripped of their belongings and released. That was what guerrillas usually did with unarmed prisoners. Bill's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. His hand rested on the Colt Navy revolver at his hip. "I will not ask again." 23 Union soldiers began removing their uniforms, their coats, their shirts, their trousers, their boots, everything with Union insignia. They stood in their undergarments in the September sun, confused, afraid, but still hoping. Surely they would not be killed. They were unarmed. They had surrendered. The laws of war protected prisoners. Surely. Bill Anderson looked at the pile of blue uniforms on the ground. Then he looked back at the men. Now run. For one terrible moment, there was silence. The soldiers looked at each other. Was this real? Was he letting them go? Some started to turn, started to take a step away from the platform, started to believe they might survive this day. They did not understand what they were dealing with. Bill Anderson pulled his revolver. His men did the same. 80 pistols were raised toward 23 unarmed men standing in their underwear on a train platform in Missouri. And Bill Anderson said one more thing before the shooting started. 5 words that would be remembered by the only survivor of what came next. "This is for Josephine." The first shot hit a sergeant in the chest. He fell backwards onto the wooden platform, dead before he hit the ground. Then the rest of the guerrillas opened fire. The noise was deafening, 80 pistols firing simultaneously. Smoke filled the air. Screams mixed with gunshots. Men fell in clusters, their bodies crumpling like puppets with cut strings. Some of the soldiers tried to run. They got perhaps 10 feet before bullets found their backs. One man dove under the train, trying to hide between the wheels. A guerrilla dismounted and shot him where he lay. In less than 3 minutes, 22 of the 23 Union soldiers were dead or dying on the Centralia platform. But here is where the story gets even darker. Bill Anderson did not just execute them. He interrogated them. Witnesses, civilians who were still on the train watching through the windows in horror, testified later about what they heard. As his men were shooting, Bill Anderson walked among the bodies. When he found one still alive, he would kneel down and ask a question. The same question, every time. Were you at Kansas City? Were you part of Order Number 11? He was looking for the men who killed his sister. Even here, even in the middle of a massacre, he was still looking for them, still trying to find the specific individuals responsible for that building collapse, still trying to make his revenge personal. Most of the soldiers were too young. They had nothing to do with General Ewing's orders. They had nothing to do with the building collapse. They were just soldiers heading home on leave. But it did not matter. One sergeant, bleeding from a wound in his stomach, knowing he was about to die, looked up at Bill Anderson and said something that witnesses would never forget. Please. I have 3 children. Please. I have 3 children who are waiting for their father to come home. Bill Anderson's expression did not change. His voice was flat, empty. My sister was 14 years old. She screamed for 6 minutes while Union soldiers watched. How old are your children? He pulled the trigger. When the shooting stopped, 22 men lay dead on the platform, but one soldier was still alive, a sergeant named Thomas Goodman. He had been pulled aside before the shooting started. No one knows exactly why Bill spared him. Some historians believe it was for prisoner exchange. Others believe Bill saw something in Goodman's face. Recognition, perhaps, or genuine ignorance of Order Number 11. What is certain is that Thomas Goodman was taken prisoner. He would be exchanged later and survive the war. His testimony is one of the primary historical sources for what happened at Centralia. But the horror was not over. After the executions, Bill's men set fire to the train. They mutilated some of the bodies. A practice common in guerrilla warfare on both sides, though rarely discussed in polite history. They took weapons and ammunition from the depot, and then Bill Anderson gave an order that would determine the fate of 147 more men. Do not leave Centralia. We wait here. His men looked at each other. Wait? For what? They had just massacred Union soldiers in broad daylight. Every Union regiment in Missouri would be hunting them within hours. The smart move was to ride fast and disappear into the wilderness. But Bill Anderson was not interested in smart moves. He was interested in revenge. And he knew something his men did not. Word would spread. A Union force would come to investigate, and when they came. Bill Anderson smiled. It was not a pleasant thing to see. Let them come. The news of the Centralia massacre reached the Union garrison at Paris, Missouri within hours. A telegraph operator had escaped during the attack and spread the alarm. The message was simple and terrifying. Bloody Bill Anderson had stopped a train and executed at least 20 unarmed soldiers. Major A.V.E. Johnston was the commander of the newly formed 39th Missouri Infantry. His regiment was green, mostly inexperienced soldiers who had never seen real combat. But Johnston was a proud man, an ambitious man. When he heard about Centralia, he saw an opportunity. Bloody Bill Anderson was the most wanted man in Missouri. Capturing or killing him would make Johnston famous, would make him a hero, would advance his career faster than years of regular service. This is the kind of thinking that gets men killed in war. Pride over prudence, ambition over caution. Johnston wanted glory so badly that he could not see the trap being laid for him. Johnston gathered his men, 147 soldiers, 3 companies, mounted infantry with single-shot carbines and no cavalry training. They were not equipped for a fight against guerrillas. They were barely equipped for a fight against anyone. But Johnston did not care. He had numbers. 147 against 80, nearly 2-to-1 odds. In his mind, it was already over. He gave the order to ride for Centralia. Bill Anderson was waiting. He had positioned his men in a field just outside of town. 80 guerrillas on horseback, each carrying 4 to 6 fully loaded revolvers. That was another thing about bushwhackers that regular soldiers never understood until it was too late. They did not fight like soldiers. They fought like cavalry assassins. A Union infantryman of 1864 typically carried a single-shot rifle or carbine. To fire again, he had to reload, a process that took approximately 20 seconds for a trained soldier under ideal conditions. Much longer in combat. 20 seconds. Remember that number. In 20 seconds, a bushwhacker could fire 24 shots. A bushwhacker carried multiple revolvers, 6 shots per gun, 24 to 36 shots before needing to reload anything, and they reloaded their cylinders ahead of time. Spare cylinders in their pockets. They could fire continuously. In a close-quarters mounted fight, this was a death sentence for anyone who faced them. Major Johnston did not know this. When he arrived outside Centralia with his 147 men, he saw Bill Anderson's guerrillas in the distance. Approximately 30 of them were visible. Bill had hidden the rest in the tree line. Johnston saw 30 men. He had 147, 5-to-1 odds. He made his decision. Dismount, form a line, fire a volley, standard infantry tactics. It was exactly what Bill Anderson expected him to do. It was exactly what Bill Anderson wanted him to do. 122 of his men dismounted. 25 were left holding the horses. The infantry formed a line, raised their carbines and fired a single volley at the distant guerrillas. The range was too far. The bullets fell short, and then Bill Anderson gave his order, charge. What happened next lasted approximately 3 minutes. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. 80 mounted guerrillas charged directly at 122 dismounted infantrymen who had just fired their only shot. The soldiers tried to reload. 20 seconds. They did not have 20 seconds. Bill Anderson was at the front of the charge. His horse was the fastest. His revolvers were already in his hands. He fired as he rode, and every shot found a target. The guerrillas hit the Union line like a wave. Pistols at point-blank range, horses trampling men who tried to run, screams and gunfire and chaos. The 25 men holding the horses panicked. The animals bolted. Suddenly, the surviving infantry had no way to retreat. They were on foot, surrounded by mounted killers with empty rifles and no hope. Major Johnston tried to rally his men. He was still mounted, one of the few officers who had not dismounted. He drew his saber and charged toward Bill Anderson personally. It was brave. It was foolish. It was exactly what a proud, ambitious man would do in his final moments. He never got close. A 17-year-old guerrilla named Jesse James rode up beside Johnston and shot him twice in the head. The major fell from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. Jesse James had just made his first famous kill. It would not be his last. The aftermath of the charge was worse than the charge itself. With Johnston dead and the line broken, Bill's men hunted down the survivors. One by one, some soldiers tried to surrender. They threw down their empty rifles and raised their hands. It made no difference. Remember what Bill had done on the train platform. He did the same thing here. His men executed prisoners. They mutilated bodies. They scalped the dead and dying. 123 Union soldiers died that day outside Centralia. Out of 147 who rode with Major Johnston, only 24 survived. Mostly men who ran fast enough to escape into the woods. In total, between the train platform and the field battle, 145 Union soldiers died at Centralia. Bloody Bill Anderson lost 3 men. 3. It was the most lopsided engagement of the entire Civil War for its size, a tactical masterpiece built on horror and revenge. That evening, Bill Anderson gathered his men and rode away into the Missouri wilderness. He knew Union reinforcements would be coming. He knew his time was limited. He knew that Centralia had sealed his fate. The entire Union army in Missouri would not rest until he was dead. But as he rode, he reached into his saddlebag. His fingers touched worn fabric, blood-stained cotton, Josephine. He had killed 145 men that day. It would never be enough. It would never bring her back. But for one afternoon in September, He had made the Union pay. 29 days later, Bloody Bill Anderson would be dead. But what happened to his body after his death? That is a story that reveals just how much hatred this man had inspired, and it involves something that even the history books struggle to describe. The news of Centralia spread across Missouri like a shockwave. Telegraph wires hummed with frantic messages. Union commanders could not believe the reports. 145 soldiers dead, 23 executed on a train platform, an entire company massacred in 3 minutes, and the man responsible had simply ridden away. General William Rosecrans, commander of the Department of Missouri, issued immediate orders. Every available unit was to hunt for Bloody Bill Anderson, kill on sight, no quarter, no negotiations, no prisoner exchanges, just death. For the first time since the war began, the Union Army in Missouri had a single, unified purpose: destroy William Anderson and everyone who rode with him. But Bill knew this was coming. He had known it before he ever stopped that train. In the days following Centralia, Bill Anderson did something unexpected. Instead of hiding, instead of fleeing south into Confederate territory, he kept fighting. He raided more towns, attacked more patrols, killed more Union soldiers. It was as if Centralia had broken something inside him that could not be put back together. Or perhaps it had always been broken, and Centralia simply removed the last pretense of sanity. His men noticed the change. Bill had always been intense, focused, but now he was reckless. He took risks that made no tactical sense. He charged into situations where any rational commander would retreat. Frank James, Jesse's older brother, who had ridden with Bill since the beginning, later said that Bill stopped sleeping after Centralia. He would sit on his horse all night, watching the darkness, touching the fabric in his saddlebag, waiting for something. Maybe Union soldiers, maybe death, maybe both. A man who does not sleep is a man who does not think clearly. A man who does not think clearly is a man who makes mistakes. And on October 26, 1864, 29 days after Centralia, Bloody Bill Anderson made his last mistake. The ambush was set near Albany, Missouri. Union militia under Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Cox had been tracking Bill's movements for days. They knew his patterns. They knew he preferred certain roads through certain valleys. They knew that on October 26th, he would be riding through a narrow stretch of road bordered by timber on both sides. Perfect ground for an ambush. Cox positioned his men in the tree line. 150 riflemen with orders to fire the moment Bill Anderson came into view. No warning, no challenge, just a wall of lead. Bill rode at the front of his column. Of course he did. He always did. His long black hair was loose, flowing behind him as he rode. His coat was open despite the October chill. His hands were near his revolvers. He did not see the ambush until it was too late. The first volley hit him 4 times, 2 bullets to the head, 2 to the chest. He stayed in his saddle for perhaps 3 seconds, an eternity for a man with those wounds, and then he fell. William T. Anderson, Bloody Bill, the most feared man in Missouri, was dead at 24 years old. 24 years old, think about that. Today, a 24-year-old might be graduating from college, might be planning a wedding, might be just starting to figure out who they want to be. Bill Anderson, at 24, had killed more men than he could count, had lost everything he loved, had become a monster, and died one. His men scattered. Some escaped into the woods. Some were killed in the crossfire. The survivors would regroup later and continue fighting until the war ended. But their leader was gone. The rage that had driven them was gone. Everything that made them terrifying was gone. But what happened to Bill's body after his death? That reveals just how much hatred he had inspired on both sides. The Union soldiers did not simply bury Bloody Bill Anderson. They stripped his body and photographed it. This was unusual for 1864. Photography was expensive and time-consuming. But Bill was famous enough, or infamous enough, that someone wanted proof. The photograph still exists. It shows a young man with dark hair lying on a wooden board, his eyes closed, his wounds visible. He looks almost peaceful, like he is sleeping. He was not at peace in death. They displayed his body in Richmond, Missouri for 3 days. 3 days. They propped him up against a wall so everyone could see, so everyone could confirm that the monster was really dead. And then the crowds came. Union sympathizers, families of men who had died at Centralia, women who had lost husbands and sons and brothers to bushwhacker raids. They came by the hundreds. They did not come to mourn, they came to stab him. Historical records confirm that multiple women brought knives to the display. They cut into Bill's corpse repeatedly. Not to kill him, he was already dead, but to desecrate him, to hurt him even after death, to express a hatred so deep that physical destruction was the only outlet. They cut off his trigger finger. Some reports say they cut off more. His body was mutilated beyond recognition before they finally buried him in an unmarked grave. Bill Anderson had wanted revenge for his sister. He got it at Centralia. But the cycle of vengeance does not end. It never ends, it simply passes to the next generation. And it passed to a 17-year-old boy named Jesse James. Jesse James survived Centralia. He survived the war. And when the Confederacy surrendered in 1865, Jesse did something that many veterans did. He could not stop. The war had trained him too well. He was too good at violence, too comfortable with death. The skills he had learned under Bloody Bill Anderson, riding, shooting, ambushing, killing, were not skills that translated to peacetime farming. So Jesse kept riding, kept shooting, kept robbing. His first major robbery happened in February 1866, less than a year after the war ended. The Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri. Jesse and his gang rode into town in broad daylight, just like they had ridden into Centralia. They walked into the bank, drew their pistols, and took everything in the vault. On their way out, they shot and killed a 19-year-old college student named George Wymore. He was just walking across the street, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another innocent victim of the violence that Centralia had set in motion. With his brother Frank and a gang of fellow former guerrillas, Jesse James launched a 16-year crime spree that would make him the most famous outlaw in American history. Banks, trains, stagecoaches, he robbed them all. And he was good at it. The same tactics that had destroyed Major Johnston's regiment at Centralia. Fast horses, multiple pistols, overwhelming violence at close range. Worked just as well against Pinkerton detectives and bank guards. The newspapers made Jesse famous. Some painted him as a villain. Others, especially Southern sympathizers who still resented the Union, painted him as a hero, a Robin Hood of Missouri, a rebel who refused to surrender even after the Confederacy fell. Jesse played into this mythology. He wrote letters to newspapers defending his actions. He claimed the banks he robbed were run by Northern carpetbaggers. He positioned himself as a man fighting for the common people against wealthy interests. It was propaganda. Jesse James was not Robin Hood. He was a killer who had learned his trade under Bloody Bill Anderson. Every bank robbery, every train holdup, every shooting. They were all extensions of what he had learned at Centralia. Jesse never forgot what he learned from Bill Anderson, never forgot what happened at Centralia. In many ways, the Jesse James of legend, the ruthless outlaw, the man who showed no fear, the killer with cold eyes, was created on that September afternoon in 1864. Bill Anderson died at 24. But his legacy lived on through Jesse James for another 17 years. Jesse himself was killed in 1882, shot in the back of the head by Robert Ford, a member of his own gang who wanted the reward money. He was 34 years old. He had outlived his mentor by a decade, but he met the same violent end. And through the legend of Jesse James, through the dime novels and movies and television shows, the spirit of Centralia lives on to this day. Every time someone tells a story about Jesse James, they are telling a story that traces back to a train platform in Missouri, back to a man with a dead sister's dress in his saddlebag, back to a question asked of dying men. Were you at Kansas City? Violence begets violence. Revenge begets revenge. A 14-year-old girl dies under rubble, and generations later we are still telling stories about the men her death created. But there is one more thing about Centralia that most people never discuss. Something that makes the entire massacre even more tragic. Remember Sergeant Thomas Goodman, the one Union soldier Bill Anderson spared on the train platform? Goodman was exchanged for a Confederate prisoner 2 weeks later. He survived the war. He lived into the 20th century, and in his later years, he wrote about what happened at Centralia. His account confirms most of what we know: the stripped uniforms, the executions, the question about Order Number 11. But Goodman added one detail that appears nowhere else. He said Bill Anderson was crying. Not during the executions, not during the interrogations, but afterwards. When the shooting stopped and the bodies lay still on the platform, Goodman said he saw Bill dismount from his horse, walk to the pile of Union uniforms, and stand there in silence for several minutes, and tears were running down his face. Goodman could not explain it. Neither can historians. Was Bill crying for his victims? For himself? For Josephine? For everything he had become and everything he had lost? We will never know. But it suggests something important about Bloody Bill Anderson, something the Union reports and the horror stories never mention. He was not a monster. He was a man. A broken man. A man who had lost everything and found nothing to replace it except revenge. A man who killed 145 people at Centralia and then wept over their bodies. The Civil War created many men like Bill Anderson, men who entered the conflict as farmers and left it as killers, men who never recovered, men who died young and violently because they could not imagine any other way to live. The Kansas-Missouri border war was the worst of it, the most personal, the most brutal. Order Number 11, the prison collapse, the scalping and the mutilation. Neither side had clean hands. Neither side was innocent. And in the middle of it all, a 14-year-old girl named Josephine Anderson screamed for 6 minutes under a pile of rubble while soldiers watched. Everything that happened at Centralia, the train, the platform, the executions, the cavalry charge, the 145 dead, all of it traces back to that building in Kansas City, to those 6 minutes, to one girl. This is not a story about heroes and villains. The Civil War was not that simple. Missouri was not that simple. Nothing about the human capacity for violence is that simple. We like our history clean. Good guys and bad guys, noble causes and evil empires. It makes the past easier to understand, easier to teach, easier to put in textbooks and wrap up in neat little chapters. But real history is messy. Real history is full of people who did terrible things for understandable reasons, full of victims who became perpetrators, full of cycles of violence that span generations and destroy everything they touch. Centralia is that kind of history, the uncomfortable kind, the kind that does not fit into easy categories. Bill Anderson was a murderer. That is undeniable. He killed unarmed men. He mutilated bodies. He collected scalps. By any modern standard, by any standard at all, he was a war criminal. But he was also a brother who lost his 14-year-old sister to men in uniform. He was also a son who watched his family destroyed. He was also a young man who had nowhere to put his grief except into a pistol. The Union soldiers he killed at Centralia were also victims. They were just men going home on leave. Many of them had nothing to do with Order Number 11 or the building collapse in Kansas City. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They paid for the sins of men they had never met, and the women who stabbed Bill's corpse after his death. They were also victims, widows and mothers and sisters who had lost their own loved ones to bushwhacker violence. Their hatred was just as real as Bill's, just as deep, just as destructive. None of that excuses what Bill did, but it explains it. And understanding is the first step toward making sure it never happens again. Because the patterns of Centralia are not unique to the Civil War, they repeat throughout history. In every conflict, on every continent, wherever human beings have lived, they have found reasons to hate each other, found reasons to kill each other, found reasons to continue cycles of violence that should have ended generations ago. The names change, the weapons change, the uniforms change, but the pattern remains the same. Someone loses something they love. Someone seeks revenge. More people die. More people seek revenge. The cycle continues until there is nothing left to destroy. You have just heard one of the darkest stories of the American Civil War, the kind they do not teach in schools, the kind that makes you question what you thought you knew about history. Stories like this, the hidden massacres, the forgotten atrocities, the human beings behind the legends. Take time to research and tell properly. When you click Super Thanks, you are not just supporting a channel. You are saying, this history matters. Every contribution helps us uncover more forgotten stories from the shadows of American history. If you are still watching, I want to leave you with one final thought. Centralia happened 160 years ago. The men who killed and died there are long gone. The hatred that fueled them should be ancient history. But is it? Look at the world today. Look at the cycles of revenge that still turn. Look at the children who lose parents to violence and grow up to become violent themselves. Look at the men who cannot stop fighting because they have forgotten how to do anything else. The details change. The weapons change. The uniforms change, but the pattern remains. A girl dies. Her brother seeks revenge. 145 men die. More brothers seek revenge. The cycle continues forever. Bill Anderson thought he was balancing a scale, an eye for an eye, a death for a death. But scales of that kind never balance. They only add more weight to both sides until everything collapses. Josephine Anderson was 14 years old. She probably liked to laugh. She probably had dreams about her future. She probably never imagined that her death would lead to the deaths of hundreds of others, that her brother would become one of the most feared killers of the 19th century, that her name would be remembered only in connection with massacre and revenge. She deserved better than that. They all did. The Centralia massacre raises a question that has no easy answer. If your 14-year-old sister was crushed to death by enemy soldiers while others watched, how far would you go? What would you become? Most of us like to believe we would stay human, that we would find justice through proper channels, that we would grieve and heal and move on. But Bill Anderson shows us another possibility, a darker one, a possibility that exists inside every human being who has ever lost someone they loved. He shows us what happens when the grief has nowhere to go, when the system that should provide justice is the same system that caused the injustice, when revenge becomes the only religion that makes sense anymore. Bill Anderson was not born a monster. He was made one. And the most terrifying thing about his story is how understandable the transformation is. Would you have done the same? Be honest with yourself. If they killed your sister, if they killed your mother, if they burned your home and destroyed everything you loved, what would you become? History remembers Bloody Bill Anderson as a villain, and he was. He killed unarmed men. He executed prisoners. He scalped the dead. There is no way to defend those actions, but history also forgets that villains are made, not born. That every massacre has a backstory. That every killer was once a child who knew nothing of blood. There is a photograph of Bill Anderson taken after his death. In it, he looks young, almost peaceful. If you did not know his story, you might think he was just a boy who fell asleep. You would never guess the horrors he had committed. You would never guess the horrors that had been committed against him. That photograph is a reminder that evil does not always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like a 24-year-old with dark hair and empty eyes. Sometimes it looks like a brother who loved his sister. Sometimes it looks like all of us on our worst days, when the grief becomes too much to bear. We tell ourselves that we would never do what Bill Anderson did, that we are better than that we would find another way, but how many of us have ever been truly tested? How many of us have ever lost everything and been given a weapon and a target? The truth is, we do not know, we cannot know, and perhaps that uncertainty is the most important lesson of Centralia. Josephine Anderson was 14 when she died. Bill Anderson was 24 when he died. 145 Union soldiers died at Centralia. Jesse James carried what he learned there for the rest of his short, violent life, and none of it had to happen. That is the tragedy of Centralia, not just the deaths, not just the brutality, but the fact that all of it, every single bit of it, could have been prevented if Order Number 11 had never been issued, if that building in Kansas City had not collapsed, if a 14-year-old girl had lived to see her 15th birthday. But history does not deal in what-ifs. History deals in what happened, and what happened at Centralia, Missouri on September 27, 1864, was one of the darkest days in American history. 23 unarmed men were stripped of their uniforms and executed on a train platform. 147 soldiers charged against guerrillas, and only 24 returned. A young man named Jesse James killed his first famous victim, and began his transformation into legend. And a broken man named Bill Anderson, carrying his dead sister's bloody dress in his saddlebag, wept over the bodies of men he had just murdered. This is the civil war they do not teach you about. The war of neighbors against neighbors, the war where both sides committed atrocities, the war that created monsters out of ordinary men and left wounds that took generations to heal. Remember Centralia. Remember Josephine. Remember Bill. And remember what happens when revenge becomes the only language anyone speaks. What do you think? Was Bloody Bill Anderson a monster, or a product of monstrous times? There is no easy answer. History rarely offers easy answers. Perhaps the most honest answer is both. He was a monster, and he was made by monsters, and the world he lived in was monstrous. And all of those things are true at the same time. That is the tragedy of war. That is the tragedy of revenge. That is the tragedy of Centralia. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This is one of those stories where every perspective matters, where there are no easy answers, where the line between victim and villain blurs until you cannot tell the difference anymore. And if this video made you think, if it showed you something about the Civil War you did not know before, if it made you question things you thought you knew about good and evil and the human capacity for violence, consider subscribing. We have more forgotten stories to tell, more dark corners of history to explore, more questions without easy answers. Until next time, remember that history is never as simple as heroes and villains. It is made by human beings, broken human beings, people who loved and lost and made terrible choices, people who were capable of both kindness and cruelty, people who in different circumstances might have lived completely different lives, just like us.